Right. The good thing with him is he uses the data that he gets in the PRC. So, you know, because in the past, when we have little discussions, the first thing they'll come back with is, oh, you know, your data is all Western or wherever. But if you use their own tunes, you know, this is the...
so we are live on Facebook.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sampila.
Thank you very much. So, thank you. I hope a couple of folks have, you know, I was going to say tuned in, but you can see that's an analog description. Clicked into this discussion that we're having between four of us with the different organizations, and we're going to be just in a broad discussion on the human rights and currently in this situation, the PRC's disinformation campaign and its impact on many issues that are actually quite close now to many Canadians, thanks to COVID-19. Our format can be quite simple, and let me start off. Perhaps we could just introduce each by name quickly, and then we can go on to the next. So may I call on, I think, Dr. Burton?
Would you like me to make a statement to start with?
Just a quick introduction, and then I'll read the blurb, your biodata, or some small part of it.
I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy. And my main focus of my work is on Canada-China relations and Chinese domestic politics. I was educated in China many years ago, and continue to have a great deal of interest in that place, and a lot of concern about the current political situation, and of course the human rights concerns, particularly of ethnic minority peoples who are living in the People's Republic of China. So I think that pretty much summarizes what I've been doing all of these more than 40 years now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Charles. And what I want to just add is that knowledge you have from the ground, you studied there, you were served twice in a senior diplomatic post. I think that gives you such a different perspective, and that you both the granular detail and the larger picture you bring and with the analysis. So that's a pretty unbeatable combination. So thank you very much. Gloria, if I may ask you quickly, and then we'll go back to introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Gloria Fung. I'm the president of Canada Hong Kong Link, and also the former national vice president of Chinese Canadian National Council. I'm also one of the chief organizer of Canadian and global campaign supporting Hong Kong and opposing to the Chinese authoritarian regime. Over the past 3 decades in Canada, I've also been closely monitoring the operation of the Chinese sharp power in Canada. And I have been doing, trying my utmost to raise awareness of Canadians as well as our government towards the infiltration, manipulation of the Chinese Communist Party on Canadian soil.
Thank you very much, Gloria. And just to add that I think at the same time, I note that you have had long experience of working in China. And again, so very critical, because it then gives you a perspective and a sense of the inner workings of these things that is very much more difficult if you're only from the outside. Yes. So I think that's the added bonus again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, then Marcus, if you could say a few words about yourself, and then I'll see if I can fill in.
Absolutely, happy to. My name is Marcus Kolga. I am, like Charles, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I've been looking at disinformation and foreign influence operations, primarily the Russian kind, over the past 10, 12 years or so. And I've been really ramping up this work over the past, I'd say 4 years or so. And certainly this current pandemic is keeping me very busy. as foreign governments certainly ramp up their efforts in using COVID-19 for disinformation purposes. I've also spent a number of years leading the Canadian and international Magnitsky sanctions campaign. This is a piece of legislation in Canada that allows our government to place sanctions on individual human rights abusers, foreign officials, corrupt foreign officials who abuse human rights. And so that work is continuing as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And just very briefly, I'm not, I don't have quite the resume the three of you have, but I've been for 23 years UN development specialist, and in that role, I have worked in countries as diverse as Myanmar for 4 years, Sudan, Laos, and Turkmenistan for 3. My last posting, obviously in India and Bangladesh, but in Nepal, but they were different entities in terms of, you know, being democratic entities. I have dealt with Kyrgyzstan also, and Haiti, Nigeria. So I bring that sort of little bit of a ground up perspective, but I have seen the Belt and Road Initiative at work both in Africa, Central Asia, firsthand. So thank you. And now if I could ask, Charles, if you could take 5 to 8 minutes and give us your sense of this issue in terms of the interference and the manipulation, actually, in Canada.
Sure. I did prepare a few words. It's only about
Great.
7 minutes long.
Excellent.
I'd really like to talk about the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party's disinformation campaign here in Canada and throughout the world, which is one of our themes for this evening. You know, really, I think the main focus of the disinformation campaign is the PRC's claim that the Chinese Communist Party regime is the contemporary extension of the tradition of a great and ancient Chinese civilization that has made enormous contribution to the history of humanity. And part of this disinformation is the assertion that China will rise again to displace the West as the leading superpower dominating global international relations. So, you know, we're supposed to accept this as having an inevitability about it. Xi Jinping's international relations theory, which is the community of the common destiny of mankind, is based on the presumption that the United States, as a global power, the global superpower, is in rapid domestic decline, and the US is therefore also losing its power and charismatic prestige as a leader and a shaper of global affairs. So, you know, Xi Jinping defines the post-war multilateral institutions of global governance, such as the UN that you were so well associated with, including the Human Rights Council of the UN, other multilateral associations like the WHO, the WTO, NATO. They're all seen as transnational extensions of US interests and values, which are at odds to China's domestic and international aspirations. So that's you know, really what the focus of the disinformation is, to prepare the world for China's rise to power. And so in the years ahead, the US is expected to dissipate its national vitality and international influence, and the UN and the WTO and the rest would fade into irrelevance as China regains what it regards from history as its rightful and traditional role as the hegemon of world politics and economics. And so in the regime's information, China's history and destiny are leading to this triumphant outcome. And so that's buttressed by the Belt and Road campaign that you just referred to, which is the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. And that's put forward as a developmental strategy and framework. You know, it's painted to nations abroad as focused on connectivity and cooperation among all the countries of the world. And in fact, there are already 60 countries comprising 2/3 of the world's population who have signed on to the Belt and Road. So it's supposed to be a positive thing to bring the world together, but it really is about the infrastructural material underpinning of Xi Jinping's vision of the common destiny of mankind. So, you know, it's about all the belts and roads starting and ending in the PRC and designed to fulfill this mandate of history that China is putting out. So, but of course, this vision of the world's future is dependent on a number of factors, and in fact, I think rings very hollow against the reality of the Chinese Communist Party's appalling regime behavior. I mean, this is the same regime that insisted no one died on Tiananmen Square, or who says that 1 million or more now, I think we're up to 1.8 million Uyghurs, are happy to be in the prison camps in crowded conditions, forbidden from practicing their religion, and because they have the opportunity for vocational training and learning Mandarin Chinese. The same regime that claims that the people of Taiwan yearn to give up their hard-won democracy in favor of being ruled by a one-party autocracy out of Beijing. And of course, that the Tibetan people prefer to be ruled from Beijing and have no desire to see a return of indigenous rule by the exile regime of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is the same regime that claims that Kevin and Julia Garrett, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are spies serving dark Canadian forces, and that Canadian canola shipments are so full of contaminants that billions of dollars of PRC export contracts have to be canceled indefinitely. Well, you know, frankly, China's soft power diplomacy has not worked well for Chinese Communist Party purposes, because their assertions are simply incredible to any people who have any, you know, rational sense. But in the place of that, the Chinese Communist Party uses money diplomacy to achieve its goals. And so this money diplomacy is particularly rife in our own country, Canada, by the use of implied future benefits to business leaders and political policymakers in Canada, and of course all around the world, in exchange for paid board memberships and consultancies associated with PRC regime and state enterprises. So you see a lot of retired officials who become wealthy in retirement in enterprises associated with the PRC. And Anne-Marie Brady of New Zealand has estimated that among scholars who support China's agenda, the average amount of supplementary income they're able to generate from PRC associations comes out to about $130,000 a year. So all of this money is provided conditional on the policymaker actively supporting the regulation of their nation's relations with China on PRC terms. So, and you know, and we know what that means in terms of not raising issues of concern or supporting the Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kong or democracy activists inside China, or objecting to China's assuming territory in the South China Sea that the UN has said is international waters, not places where China should be putting up military facilities. So really, if I could just conclude, I think that there is a pressing need for nations of the world to better understand China's economic role vis-a-vis foreign countries, and the CCP PRC regime's blatant non-compliance with the principles of fairness and reciprocity that allow the international rules-based order to function to the benefit of all. Australia has instigated last year the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, which provides a scheme for the registration of persons who undertake certain activities on behalf of foreign governments and other foreign principals. So we really need some comparable legislation, because greater transparency on the foreign funding of retired office holders' activities on behalf of those foreign principles should be something that is made public. You know, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Just let me conclude by noting that, you know, really China remains a fragile superpower whose persistent denial of the rights of citizenship of people in China of all ethnic identities is based on a political narrative that is logically weak, and it could readily collapse. So you do have the sophistication of social monitoring and internet censorship enhanced by comprehensive systems of artificial technology to inhibit the spread of political dissidence, but that does have inherent limitations. In a moment of national crisis, the people in China could rapidly come to a consensus of awareness that they are living a lie, that the disinformation their government is providing to them is instrumental in their repression and a violation of the values of China's tradition that had made China a great civilization in the past. So we should hope that that happens soon, that the people of China will demand better of their political authorities. Really, the future of our democracy, freedom, security, and the integrity of the global information space is at stake. And I think we have to do our best to raise awareness and encourage a change in China's government behavior before it's too late. So let me just conclude with that, and we can discuss further in the course of the next hour or so.
Thank you very, very much. That was very panoramic and so incisive. Thank you. I think we won't take questions. We'll just go and finish the three presentations, and then we'll go on to questions and discussions. So I think next we have Marcus. You're on next on the firing line.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you, Sampa, and thank you, Sherip, for organizing this evening. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to see so many friends here and colleagues. I'm going to talk a little about the dangers of allowing regimes such as China and Russia to lead the UN Human Rights Council, but more about the tools that we have and should develop to hold them to account for their crimes. The fact that China has acquired a position on UNHRC's influential consultative group and will be involved in choosing, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on the protection of freedom of opinion and expression represents a complete breakdown of trust and failure of that organization to function as a credible international body. The fact that a government that has over the past few years rounded up between 1 and 2 million, I think Charles said 1.8 million right now, people based on their religion and ethnicity, tearing apart families and taking them from their homes by force in order to suppress and cleanse them of their ethnic identity is simply criminal. China has no business leading an international body tasked with the defense of human rights when it is the world's worst abuser of them. This is a dangerous contradiction and one that encourages China's vassals and allies, including North Korea, to continue their own mass abuses. Governments within the community of democracies, including Canada, must begin to recognize these contradictions and stand up against them. By appeasing states like China and Russia, we become complicit in enabling such behavior. Not only do regimes like those in China and Russia target their own citizens through information warfare and malign influence operations, they're now putting the lives of Canadians at risk as well. Several Western governments, including the EU, have warned that the disinformation crafted and spread by these regimes has the power to kill. Instead of working with the international community to limit the damage that coronavirus is inflicting on the West, they seek ways to amplify and intensify it, and where possible, exploit the pandemic for their own benefit. Russia, which has announced its intention to run for a UNHRC seat, has cynically used the pandemic to lobby the UN to end sanctions placed on it for its illegal annexation of Ukraine's Crimea in 2014, and its ongoing war in Ukraine's Donbass region, where a Russian Buk missile under the guidance of a Russian GRU officer downed a Malaysian civilian airliner in the summer of 2014. Just this week, in fact, An open source investigation led by Bellingcat identified a top Russian FSB officer, General Andrei Burlaka, as being linked to the downing of MH17. And through him, it places Russian President Vladimir Putin close to the decision-making hierarchy that led to this terrorist incident that killed nearly 300 civilians. Russia's active assistance with the Syrian regime's bombing of civilian targets, including hospitals, in many cases using chemical weapons, has also been well documented. In the Russian Republic of Chechnya, members of the LGBTQ community have been rounded up and placed in concentration camps where they face torture and worse. In addition to killing its critics abroad with chemical and radioactive poison, a plot to kill Prague's mayor by a Russian agent was made public last week for his support to dedicate a square in Prague in front of the Russian embassy in honor of human rights and pro-democracy leader and also my friend Boris Nemtsov. But where Chinese authorities have been allowed to engage in mass human rights abuse in Tibet, East Turkestan, Hong Kong, and intimidate Canadians of Uyghur, Tibetan, Hong Kong, and Chinese heritage without impunity, we have been able to hold Russian officials to account to a certain degree, using legislation named after a murdered Russian whistleblower, Sergei Magnitsky. Now, I've had the honor, as I mentioned before, of helping lead the Canadian global campaign for Magnitsky human rights legislation for the past 10 years. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Magnitsky sanctions, they allow governments that have adopted them to target foreign officials who abuse human rights with asset freezes and visa bans. We know that these corrupt officials like keeping their assets safe in countries like Canada that respect the rule of law, hiding them in Canadian real estate, banks, and beyond. And there is concrete evidence of this. While Canada has added many Russian, Venezuelan, South Sudanese, and Saudi Arabian names to Canada's Magnitsky list, not a single Chinese government official has been added, despite the glaring and obvious evidence of mass human rights abuse and ethnic cleansing. If Canada is truly committed to defending international human rights, this government must dig deep and find the courage to end the impunity with which these corrupt foreign officials act, terrorizing millions, including Canadians like Hussein Jalil, Michael Spavor, Michael Kovrig, the families of millions of Canadians who still live in Tibet, Hong Kong, East Turkestan. They deserve to live without fear of political or ethnic repression. And so Canada must immediately place Chinese officials who've engaged in the abuse of human rights on Canada's Magnitsky list by making an example of those officials. By making an example of those officials, we can help deter similar behavior by others and break the cycle of abuse. Canada must also work with our allies to coordinate these sanctions and to build an alliance of like-minded nations that stand up to defend and promote human rights, democracy, and freedom. Finally, we must recognize that the UNHRC has become a dysfunctional organization that enables human rights abusers and their impunity. Canada must find that courage to stand up against Chinese government intimidation and hold the regime to account for its abuses. By not doing so, we fail the victims, and most importantly, we fail ourselves. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, although you discuss Russia, I think there's such cross-cutting, validity and impact on China. And in some ways, what you're suggesting is the Chinese have been more adept at sidestepping these things, partly perhaps due to their role in globalization, which actually, I think at some point we also have to look at how globalization facilitated the regime to then create this dystopic situation with enormous sort of economic clout and no other thing. So thank you. This is good. This is very rich for a further discussion a little later today, and then to continue. Gloria, may I ask you now to say a few words?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today to have a dialogue with all our friends, from different sector on this very meaningful topic. The coronavirus pandemic has hugely reshaped our world order. China has launched an unprecedented and massive global disinformation campaign to deflect blame and portray itself as a global savior. To do this, China is also amplifying Russia's disinformation campaign, implying that the source of COVID-19 was Americans, and emphasizing that US and Western allies failed to take care of their own citizens. The Chinese Communist Party employs a whole of government approach using political, economic, military, and also information tools to advance its influence all over the world. It has basically spread disinformation via social media platforms and also its global television network, CGTN. It has also implemented several other strategies simultaneously. Number one, China is spreading the narrative through its influence on international institutions. The WTO ED has repeatedly praised China, claiming it was transparent and cooperated with the WHO to contain the outbreak, even though the CCP did not provide a timely warning to the world about the risks of pandemic. Number two, alongside with the mass diplomacy and also money diplomacy in countries badly hit by coronavirus pandemic, the Chinese Communist Party constantly exerts pressure on countries and international institutions investigating how China handled the crisis. A EU report on disinformation around the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic was under pressure from Beijing to remove some of the references of a global disinformation before the final report was published. And the fact that these international institutions and countries kowtow to pressure from China would cause damage to our democratic process around the world. In China, I've also witnessed the full mobilization of China's United Front organizations and here to enhance the effect of its disinformation campaign. A few months ago, an editorial group consisting of mainly representatives from several mainland Chinese newspaper have actually formed an editorial group claiming that they will be responsible for distribution of correct information to all the Canadian media. At the United Nations, China has repeatedly blocked virtually all resolutions condemning human rights abuses everywhere in the world, working together with a group of other nations with poor human rights records. These countries systematically undermine the UN's efforts to improve global human rights. Now this year, for example, China lobbied to slash funding for human rights efforts stationed in UN peacekeeping missions. And in order to prevent them from reporting on human rights abuses in the world's most dangerous places, even though none of these officers was stationed in China, the CCP protects the reputation of allied countries that violate human rights so that these countries will support China when it faces criticism for its appalling human rights record. It is therefore outrageous that China is a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it was even more outrageous that it was appointed to the panel that chooses experts that monitor human rights globally. The issues being monitored include suppression of freedom of speech, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances. So the Chinese Communist Party, which has violated human rights in all these areas, will chair some of the committees that nominate the UN staff that investigate and report on these. Just like what the executive director of UN Watch has said, it is just like making a paramedic into a fire chief. The CCP has also been able to manipulate many of the world's governments, but it's very fearful of NGOs that they cannot control. So China repeatedly blocks NGOs from participating in UN's activities. In an unusual move, at the time of the Chinese President Xi's keynote address at the UN Geneva meeting in 2020, the United Nations has pressure into blocking NGOs from attending. In Hong Kong, in April this year, on April 18, under the Beijing's new hotline policy, the Communist Party puppet government arrested 15 prominent democracy activists, including Martin Lee, who's very well known to be the father of Hong Kong democracy. They were charged with taking part in peaceful protests in 2019. The CCP launched this attack on human rights while the rest of the world is preoccupied with coronavirus pandemic. This act to silent dissent and instigate white terror appears to aim at disrupting the pro-democracy forces in the lead up to the September Legislative Council election. So what can we do to combat on the direct threat to the democracy as a result of the CCP's disinformation campaign and China's growing influence on the UN Human Rights Council panel? I would like to share with you a few points that I've thought of, but I would welcome discussion maybe later on when we come to the group discussion. Number one, we need to learn as far as this information is concerned. I think the world needs to learn from the Taiwan experience in dealing with this information. In Taiwan, there's a very close collaboration between the civil society and the government. Say, for instance, at the civil society, there's a Taiwan fact check center that helps to identify this information, post, and report it to the general public very quickly. And at the same time, the transparency and responsiveness of the government also help to ensure that their citizens can distinguish between credible and false information. And this is a very effective way to provide immunity towards disinformation. Number two, we should also, all democratic countries need to work together to retake control of international institutions such as WHO, WTO, United Nations, etc. Canada also needs to play a more active role in this endeavor with like-minded allies. Number three, governments also need to collaborate closely together to hold China accountable for coronavirus pandemic. We need to address the Communist Party's corruption and abuse of human rights in the context of the coronavirus outbreak. And number four, we also need to build a national and also global campaign sanctioning Chinese officials responsible for the coronavirus pandemic and abuses of human rights. Actually, early this year, together with Marcus and also the Uyghur and Tibetan community organizations, we have kicked off Canada-Hong Kong link, together with all these allies, we have kicked off a national campaign to sanction Chinese officials. And we hope very much that we would like to, we'll be able to engage more civil society organizations in this very important endeavor. So hopefully we can also hold the Chinese officials accountable for abuses of human rights and also the pandemic. Last but not least, Canada needs to come up with a very strong foreign policy towards China and Hong Kong. And we also need to revisit our strategy towards China. And the Canadian government needs to work very closely with civil society in developing effective and also appropriate long-term strategy in dealing with China, which has become a common threat to the Western democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. A lot of food for thought and action, policy action, and cooperation. So thank you. So now it's my turn, and I've already introduced myself. I'm going to do this in two stages because given what we've said, we're dealing with the current situation in China's role in the global arena, which at one level, from the ground up, I've actually seen this happen. And then a bit on the Tibetan issue. A couple of things, because I think people have, familiarity of people now with Tibetan issues, less and less as time moves. But we have been in exile since 1959, so it's a very long running exile. And in that time, we have faced, the whole range of the power of the Communist Party of China, both in Tibet, obviously, and out of Tibet many times. Although that, with China's growing globalization, ironically, their extension and reach has grown so much. And I remember the discussions in the 80s or late 80s, and the issue was, it's very good globalization. It's going to bring China out, and there'll be democracy. And it's flipped it. They've used it, at least we're talking about the CCP, to advance the interests of the party, and as you have said, conflated as the interests of the nation. One of the things I think that's critical to understand, because the Chinese always are abusive of Tibetans, especially His Holiness, who's the gentlest of men, and called him a splittist. That's one of the nicer things. But in '88, he actually, enunciated the middle way policy. And he said, look, we're ready not to talk about independence. And I think the measures that he talked about are a kind of federalization of China that within that could really be useful for all of China. So it's not just for Tibetans, but that discussion never went anywhere because this scared the totalitarian and unitary state perspectives of the Communist Party. But it's very well worth, I think, when we advocate for Tibet, the issue is that we're not just advocating only for Tibetans in a sense. It's of how the state treats its people and what are the responsibilities. The major issues you know very well, but one of the areas that the CCP have really, honed down into is they see any other form of allegiance, ideology, which they call religion, to be problematic for them. And so the monks and nuns in Tibet have borne the brunt of the most brutal, horrific repression, which is not to say that they haven't set up a system for the others. What's interesting is all of the things they did with the Uyghurs, it was first piloted in Tibet. And then the security chief who did all this was, after 8 years of setting up that whole system, was then sent to Xinjiang with a big promotion. So, the Tibetans have felt the whole brunt of this. In the Canadian sense, if you like, in the 70s and 80s, there was not a great deal, but the game changer has been both the influence of the Chinese PRC and the CCP through the United Works groups, the affiliation of other groups here, and there's a large body of students who are used as a sort of a floating cadet corps. And you see this because there are fewer and fewer universities in which you can actually have a discussion on Tibet without it being broken up by these folks. And the power they have is money power, because it's like Harvard now, I don't think that His Holiness can make a speech there anymore, because 800 students plus will not just come and try to disturb it, but will threaten to leave. That's a huge blow economically. So again, as you mentioned, Charles, the use of money power in this way has, recently we had, there was a fake last year, a fake Tibetan association was set up.
Yes.
And what undid them, and here's where these goons always trip up, they actually had a letter purporting to come from the Prime Minister's office that welcomed them. And of course, it was a fake. So they basically shot themselves this time in the foot because their own sort of, not incompetence, but the way they see the world, they think this is anywhere else this would be accepted. We're seeing more pressure at the level of universities now. A young Tibetan Canadian stood for student union elections, and she was absolutely trolled last year. Trolled, and there was death threats, and the students in the campus, Chinese students came, PRC students, and in the end, of course, the irony is all of that she won, but she went through very difficult times. So they came out. So I think that's so on that side we've also continue to face. I know for years on March 10th when we stand in front of the embassy, obviously they take our pictures, but then if you had family to visit in Tibet, you'd be denied a visa because they say you can't go see your grandparents because you were outside standing and chanting or whatever. So this is long kind of behavior that we have been very used to as Tibetans. Apropos, I think of the role of Chinese in global institutions now. It's very, very interesting. I think part of it has to do with the fact that we went through in the West a certain disenchantment, say, with the United Nations and things. And there was, funding was cut to certain organizations. The moment you do that, especially now with China being so perceptive of these things, China steps in. When Trump said he was going to, stop funds for the WHO, the next day on CGTN, there was a promise for first 50 million and then 30 million. So there's one of the conundrums as that if we step out of this engagement, I'm not saying the UN is perfect. In fact, one of the huge issues of the UN is being an organization of states. It's very difficult for states then, especially to self-reflect on their behaviors. And that's why there has been and was a move to bring more civil society in. And even, I think we need to do it more structurally. That means civil society voices must be given volition, not just invitation sort of to watch in the gallery. Because if there's not a counterpoint, then the only people who, for instance, if the Syria representative is not going to talk with the well-being of Syrian people in the regions they don't control, So that's something I think there's a conundrum when the West moves out. And I know this because funding is always an issue, and funding the United Nations. So then what happens is that the big chiefs look towards those who will fund them. And if the Chinese are going to sort of play paymaster, then they will dance to that tune, unfortunately. I mean, that's one of the, so this is why, ironically, we should not, for instance, let's take the WHO. The WHO's problem governance model is slightly problematic because the WHO is run by Council of Ministers. All of the governments who are members of the WHO, the health ministers sit on the council. They manage. So if I was the representative of WHO in a country, when I go to see the health minister, I have to tiptoe. Yes, I'm not going there as he's my boss or she's my boss. And some of them, take that tone, and others don't. But there is very much a sense that there's talk of UN reform that happened, and then we were waiting in the trenches. We thought, yes, that we need reform, and then it all petered out. And now we have this new situation where you have a resurgent China with huge, reserves, and they're ready to put their money. The other thing is, if you notice, for many, many years, the PLA has had no expeditionary experience. Fundamentally, all their wars have been within continental Asia. They have started actually to participate in UN peacekeeping missions in greater numbers. And part of it is, I think, almost as a training ground to allow their younger officers and units to get some sense of what it is to operate overseas. Initially, so I'm not raising an alarm. I'm just saying we have to recognize what is going on there. I think, and so the human rights issues are critical, and then we have the geostrategic overlay. I mean, the first base offshore is Djibouti. They have a very robust base in Djibouti with both naval and military and air force assets. And of course, the dictator of Djibouti is paid so many $100 million a year, and he's happy as anything. It's Christmas every day for him. So I think those are some of the challenges, and how to re-engage with how does the West, or what we call the West, democratic. I think we should also open the discussion and say that countries that are more interested in managing open systems. I mean, the last thing I know, for instance, that before all of this happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya, the Chinese cleared it with the PRC, because the PRC has some interests in the Rakhine area and building ports and things. So in that immediate neighborhood, they have become the arbiters of what happens. I mean, I think that's my piece, because there's so much to discuss from the rest. Sharabla, are there any questions from the folks listening in?
We don't have questions, but we have some comments. I think,
good.
Yeah. So maybe you can start with the questions. Would you like to? Yeah, please continue with the questions, Sampala.
Oh, okay, good. Let's see now. We'll have to go. So, I mean, we're all so much in agreement. So if there are questions, it's more a case of, drawing something out. But I mean, Charles, I think what you said there is so critical, because that historical narrative that they're wearing, and it gives credibility and a certain, linking them to old empires and things. And I once had an argument with a young person, and I said, if you ran an empire, we Tibetans would be, we would have a role in there, because we would be a distinct people living in your empire. But you've got us in a terrible space. You say we're this, but we're neither fish nor fowl in your empire. You don't have an empire. You have a unitary state, but we don't have access to all the rights. I mean, one of our issues with the PRC is that actually many of the rights granted to other citizens of PRC are not granted to Tibetans. Yeah, language is a critical one. So I think, again, for us as a lobbying point, and globally, and countries like ours, and look in Canada, we have linguistic diversity, and we have these situations flexible enough. We have two languages as official languages, and I think that way Canada represents possibilities, a federal system, sensitivity to culture. And once we start to bring in, I think, our First Nations, that's then going to make it much more viable and able to, yes, model. And the money diplomacy, I mean, it's so, but what are the prospects of something like the Foreign Influence Register Act, Charles?
Do you have any comments?
Yeah,
Marcus would like to make a comment.
Yeah.
Well, I was you were about to ask Charles, I think, about the Foreign Agents Registry Act, and I wanted to. And I was going to ask a little bit more. I mean, I'm more expert on Russia, and you're Chinese experts, and you've been watching this disinformation, and many of you have been actually the focus of Chinese disinformation, information warfare. So I would like to ask the three of you a question. And I think when we've looked at Russia, certainly since 2014 and now after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, there seems to be an awareness of it. There's an awareness of the threat that it poses to our democracy. I mean, Canada is among Western nations has been one of the slowest to acknowledge it, and we're still not doing much to address it. But when I see the Chinese influence operations, the information warfare that they're targeting in Canada, the fact that they are able to intimidate activists in Canada, the fact that when Taiwan just on Monday gifted Canada 500,000 surgical masks, whereas China did the same in March, the foreign minister responded to the Chinese gift within, I think it was 2.5 hours of it being posted on Twitter. He thanked them. We still don't have an official thanks to the Taiwanese government. The fact that the health minister, when a Canadian journalist asks about the Chinese disinformation about the initial outbreak in Wuhan, and our health minister snaps back that sort of line of questioning is reinforcing Chinese or disinformation and conspiracy theories about the Chinese origin of the virus. But how is all of this happening? Why have you found that Canadian government is not? They seem to not want to acknowledge the problem, and how can we get over that?
Okay.
And that's to all of you.
If I could just try starting with what the first part of the discussion, which is, previously China had acknowledged 56 ethnic groups in China. So when the party was still oriented towards the realization of communism, when they were still Marxist as well as Leninist, I think there was more willingness to identify with a multi-ethnic society and extend recognition to diverse elements. Now the narrative, which I gave in my remarks at the beginning, is not necessarily simply directed towards us, but it's directed towards people inside China, that the party represents what's called the Chinese nation, has to identify with the Chinese tradition, with the program of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore none of these alternative discourses are accepted. So it's a program of assimilation where, the Tibetans and the Uyghurs are reduced to a folkloric status where they sing and dance, but they don't have any religious and civilizational tradition that's acknowledged, and they're expected to assimilate into the Han Chinese majority as part of the great rise of China. So that then feeds to us abroad, where any kind of acknowledgement of the cultural distinctiveness of Tibetan Canadians is seen as challenging the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party's rule of China. So, the Chinese government uses economic leverage to enforce this political orthodoxy. So we have a situation where the governments were expected to act essentially like tributary states, which is that when the Chinese came with their PPE to those nations, that they expected the president of Czech Republic and ministers to be lined up on the tarmac and to listen to a speech by the Chinese ambassador and express their appreciation for the beneficence of the great China towards these lesser nations. And within Canada, we have a similar sort of conundrum. On the one hand, of course, the Chinese influence operations have been so effective in playing on Canadian naivete and greed. And so, people recognize that if they speak about Canadian values or human rights in ways which are not approved by the Chinese Communist Party, that there will be some economic cost to them. And then there's also the notion that political correctness, that if you say anything that's critical of the Chinese government, that you're seen as racist towards ethnic Chinese people, or that the illusion that the Canadians of Chinese origin support the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore, if you speak against Chinese Communist Party, Canadians won't support your party in the next election. And in general, I think a reluctance on the part of Canadian policymakers to adopt an approach to international relations that it's not country agnostic. In other words, refusal to acknowledge that the Chinese government's attitude towards their role in the world is different from other countries who want to collaborate in an international rules-based order. That China has an agenda and seeks to implement it, and so far has been quite successful. So I think that there are a lot of issues there, and a kind of path dependence where it's hard for our government, and not just the Liberal Party government, but past conservative governments, to acknowledge that their approach to China has been wrong, and that they need to be more responsive to public concerns about the influence of an authoritarian, autocratic, one-party regime that seeks to intimidate and coerce persons in Canada, to adopt a different policy where we say we simply will not accept this as the cost of economic engagement with you, that we have to stand for our values and the rules-based international order. And if China is not prepared to collaborate, then we will simply have to accept any kind of Chinese retaliation that the regime may make to punish Canada economically for doing this. And this does mean the dislocation of a lot of established interests in Canada who have been so integrated into the mainland paradigm of how Canada should be relating to China and the global community. So it won't be easy. And I think that the main salvation will be awareness among Canadian voters that our China policy is not serving Canada's interests and is leading us in a direction that we don't want to take our country into support of autocracy and violation of human rights. And it has to get to the point where this will affect the way that Canadians vote in elections and which political party they will support. The Canadians will take the China issue sufficiently seriously that it will impact on what political party they're prepared to select in our democratic elections. So I don't see this as a small thing because of the intensity of Canada's co-optation by the Chinese authorities, but I do think that there is an increasing awareness among Canadians that we cannot carry on like this, and it's sufficiently important that we have to make it inform our political choices in our electoral process. So, I mean, that's a long answer to your question, Marcus. So I hope it provides some sort of framework to proceed from.
I would also like to share. It seems that the screen is off on my computer. I'm not sure whether you can see me now.
Yes, we can see you.
Oh, okay.
I can see you.
I can't see anymore. So I would also like to share a bit of my thoughts on Marcus' question. I fully agree with the analysis that how foreign towards China is largely due to our naivety and also greed. However, I think we should also point out that it is also a direct result of our silent diplomacy that Canada has adopted for the last few decades, thinking that by engaging China and also cooperating with China, China will be able to advance its liberty and also democracy domestically, and at the same time engaging itself in the democratic world. But this is not happening, and it basically we only see the emerging of the China, a new so-called global China, which is mainly based on very arrogant infiltration, manipulation, and also domination of other countries, and coercing other countries to follow its own new order. And at the same time, I think the other reason leading to this phenomena is the very serious infiltration and manipulation by the Chinese Communist Party on Canadian soil that has been built up over the last few decades. As someone who has been monitoring and also studying and analyzing China's sharp power in Canada, I have seen a lot of people from different political parties, think tank organizations, academic circle, all the way to civil societies being compromised by the Chinese Communist Party as a result of their money diplomacy. And quite often when they say anything or do anything, they're not really serving the best interests of Canada, but rather acting as the mouthpiece of China on Canadian soil. Therefore, it is of course important for us to expose, the China sharp power infiltration and manipulation as a direct threat to our Canadian democracy. We also need to come up with a corresponding legislation to deal with this. Say, for instance, Charles has already mentioned about the legislation that we can learn from Australia. But I think in Canada, we also need to come up with similar legislation so that we can hold people, including politicians of our three levels of government, who are serving the best interests of a foreign power accountable. And in terms of the jeopardizing of Canadians' constitution rights of freedom of expression, as what we have experienced over the last 1 year, as we organize rallies and different social actions to support Hong Kong. And I'm quite sure that has also been commonly experienced by our Tibetan and also Uyghur community organizations. I think we need to have a corresponding legislation to cancel the visa of international students engaging in this kind of and at the same time, any Canadians, particularly our government officials and also politicians, engage in activities serving the best interests of a foreign power, including espionage or spy activities. I think we should also hold them accountable, and that should be, penalty of these people. And any diplomats that have been performing role beyond its normal diplomatic jurisdiction, say for instance, engaging themselves in the organizing of United Front organizations here, or even orchestrating counter, campaign towards Canadian actions opposing to China's influence or China's abuse of human rights around the world, should be kicked out of Canada. So I think we need to come up with very concrete legislation to deal with different types of problems posing challenges to our Canadian democracy.
Thank you.
There's one question from the audience.
Oh, sorry. Can I just also, because he asked three of us, I didn't respond to Marcus.
Yeah, go ahead, Samir.
Oh, yeah. What I want to say is, if you look at our Tibetan struggle, one of the things the Dalai Lama very early on, in fact, right from Tibet, the position was we have a huge problem with the CCP. And sometimes we have a problem with some of the other machinery government. But by and large, we never have villainized ordinary Chinese people or even others, because the whole thing was that they too are subject to whatever, norms and strictures that are going. So if we do that, we escaped the racism issue because, for instance, I, in fact, when I took over, I said to the board, we will engage in countering the CCP policies and the PRC policies, but we will never be mouthpiece for anti-Chinese. That's a whole different issue. And so I think when we do that, we keep ourselves, in that space. I just wanted to say the game changer now may be COVID-19. Today, there was a global TV item that purports, and I'd say purports because I didn't look at it very carefully, to show that very early on the party realized that the COVID-19 was going to be quite lethal, and scoured the world for PPE. We're talking billions of pieces, and just basically divested the whole market of that, used it, and when they realized they didn't need as much, they were then selling it back to countries like Mexico for 500% markups. So the COVID, I think, has given us a possibility, and Canadian, because the people can relate to these kinds of things. India recently sent back 500,000 kits, test kits, because they were substandard, and this kind of thing. But at the same time, the COVID diplomacy that China is doing, and right, even as we speak, the Canadian Canada-China Friendship Association has just gone to the hospital with 5,000 masks. The question is, thank you very much for the 5,000. What about all of that you hoovered from the international market? So, but I think it's both a threat and an opportunity here to take this kind of thing forward. Here in Ottawa, we know the mayor is trying to get some investment here in one of the technical hubs, $30–40 million. And for the last 4 years, the Tibetan Association, we're only 60 Tibetans here. We cannot get any cooperation from City Hall because as he remarked to someone, there is no such thing as Tibetans or some such reportedly. Absolutely mind-boggling statement from a man who has no knowledge of that part of the world, but he is the mayor. So, I'm just gobsmacked, as they say, by that. But he is quoting, he's been every year. And if you look every summer, all you have to do is see who gets to travel on the Chinese coin to Beijing. And, we all know if you're a select person like that, you have a marvelous time. I mean, you're made to feel like something. They're very good at this massaging egos, You land there, they take you off the, I mean, it's all done. And of course, they come back, as one of them said to me, you Tibetans always going on about China. We had such a wonderful time. They were so gracious. I said, yeah, well, it's whose pockets are being picked, So I think, yeah, this corona may give us a possibility. And then I think you're right, Gloria, rather than, I wouldn't say prosecute, but even a sort of list of shame, who are the people and who are the MPs not traveling on Canadian funds, who are traveling on PRC funds regularly to China? Who are the business leaders who go for all these junkets? Because the junkets are where that whole thing starts, and then things get deeper. And the norm may be, not just for China, but maybe if you've been ambassador to China for many years, there should be a cooling off period. You're not allowed to make money off them for the next 3 or 5 years, because so many of them at that rate, I can tell you, immediately, use their contacts. And that's one of the reasons why in the bureaucracy, there's a hesitancy to, Tibet is a little inconvenient issue, you're nice people, but you're a bit bothersome, Now the Uyghurs have been more front and center in the newspapers, but many times I feel with the officials, they're like, you're nice enough, but you're very bothersome. The larger issue is Tibet. The other large three things are this: we've two at least Canadians held hostage. I would like that language of public to be changed. These are not prisoners in any term. These are hostages.
Mm-hmm.
Our political leaders should say the kind of, all of you know better than me, when you get into the hands of the Security Bureau in China, this is this is not Mother Teresa's home, you know. I think that's critical. The canola thing is amazing that we didn't make more of that stupid thing saying that Canadian canola is so polluted. You know, it's absolute nonsense. And I think that brings other constituencies on board who see, oh my God, you know, these guys are not great. And the last one is students. I think that's a huge one because it's such a big, they bring so much money to the universities, but that money, unfortunately, even if they're private students, you know, it can be used. And so they become a kind of a floating core to do some of the footwork. Remember the Olympic torch instance and the way they managed the you know, all over the world, how the security came and actually took over in many countries and told local police what to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Shirabla, there's a question.
Yeah, I think we'll just take just one question.
Yeah,
We only have,
yeah,
not
okay.
much time. So we have a question from Edwina von Bayer from Ottawa.
Oh, yes.
The question is, when Canada's attention shifts from the coronavirus, what would be the most effective action on the part of concerned citizens to shift the federal policy on China? And the question is open to everyone.
Good.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I mean, I think that certainly, you know, it's clear that there will be a demand for accountability for how the Chinese regime did not provide fulsome and timely data to the world through the WHO. I mean, there's no question that the Chinese government is extremely resistant to this idea. And, you know, in the case of Australia last week, when the Australians suggested there should be such an investigation, the Chinese ambassador to Australia was really quite blatant about the retaliation, which is that they would retaliate with Australian wine exports to China, beef exports, limit tourists to Australia, and limit students coming to Australia. So unlike our situation where they refuse to, up to now, directly associate the non-tariff barrier applied to the canola seeds to the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou's detainment pending her extradition request. In the case of Australia, they've been absolutely explicit in connecting the economics to it. So from that point of view, China clearly doesn't want an investigation. I think the reason they don't want an investigation is because there's information there that they don't want to have made known. And I think that impacts on China domestically because, you know, the COVID-19 has spread to Canada, but the reason it's spread in China is also because of the politically motivated disinformation that was given with regard to that virus in Wuhan, you know, the not preventing 5 million people from leaving Wuhan to return to their native place for Chinese New Year, the collective potlucks that were held to celebrate Chinese New Year, where so many tens of thousands of people were eating together that then spread the disease and so on. So we have that situation. I think the other one is that, you know, there does seem to be a sea change in attitude towards China in the West. We have got our common special committee on Canada-China relations that will continue. And I think that we have to be looking at things like the canola seeds. I mean, you know, we haven't done any retaliation for China's completely unjustified bar of $3 billion a year of sales, which has a devastating impact on Western farmers. But we have to look at it the other way. China is not a reliable customer. We had a contract with them to send them those $3 billion on completely unjustified grounds. They violated the contract, causing disruption to our producers. We really have to be looking to selling to other places, not to China, to reliable partners. So I think that you know, we should be considering diversification of trade. Looking into not being so dependent on Chinese supply chains for critical inputs into the Canadian economy, including the PPE and medicines and other elements that currently we're getting almost entirely from China. And as Gloria said, I think that it's high time that we started to enforce our regulations against agents of the Chinese regime operating inside Canada, whether they have diplomatic passports and are therefore should be PNG'd, persona non grata, for engaging activities not compatible with their diplomatic role, and arresting people in Canada who are engaged in illegal activities against our laws and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including against Canadians, Camille Lamo, and the coercing of Chinese students to collaborate in activities that go against our democracy and values. So I think that in response to the question, I'm feeling somewhat optimistic that when the dust settles, that we'll reevaluate our policy and we'll start to take the measures, some of which Gloria outlined and some of which I outlined and some of which Marcus outlined, to try and deal with China in a way which is of benefit to Canada, and ultimately, I think, of benefit to the people of China as well, by ceasing to tolerate a regime that behaves in ways which are so inconsistent with normal values of fairness and reciprocity, and indeed, really, the precious civilizational values of China are not deception, coercion, violence, such as we are seeing expressed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Gloria?
Yeah, in response to the question, I think there's several areas that we need to look into in order to come up with effective strategy in dealing with China after the coronavirus pandemic has subsided. Number one, we need to seriously think about effective strategy in terms of diversification of our trade partners.
Yes.
And also the production base and distribution channels of all our Canadian industries. Number two, I think we also need to raise awareness in our community, media sector, as well as our governments towards the true nature of the Communist Party of China. I think before, particularly our government, I think they have very naive perception about, the way how we should deal with China. But I hope after the coronavirus pandemic, everybody will, realize, what kind of party we are dealing with, and that we need to come up with a corresponding change in our foreign policy towards China and Hong Kong, as well as some of the strategy in future engagement with them, because I think we need to set basic principles that we all need to adhere to, rather than kowtowing to the money policy, the money diplomacy, or even the mass diplomacy. And last but not least, as we also need to build a global alliance, daring to say no to the Communist Party regime of China. We need to we need to build alliance with like-minded allies. I think presently it is very unfortunate with the Trump administration.
Yes.
Shining away from performing a leadership role in the Western democracy, as well as UN in the world arena because of Brexit. I think there's one platform that we need to enhance probably at this stage, that is the Five Eye Network, because the Five Eye Network consists of US, Canada, Australia. Over the past few years, I think this Five Eye Network has been performing quite effectively, particularly in terms of some of the meaningful exchange in terms of espionage activities, as well as other type of issues pertaining to national security. So hopefully we can also build on this Five Eye network and see whether we can, turn it into a stronger alliance, saying no to China and also holding China accountable for its abuses of human rights as well as the coronavirus pandemic.
Marcus?
Well, just going to the Five Eyes point that Gloria's made. I mean, the first thing that we can do is announce that we're going to ban Huawei from our 5G infrastructure. We seem to be waffling on this question. I think our 5G our Five Eyes partners on that question have been pretty clear. The UK is reviewing their position, but we haven't taken one yet. Let's just ban it, and in doing so, ensuring our own national security and the privacy of our citizens. Another area that we need to look at is I think Charles and Gloria both mentioned the need to create an international coalition, an alliance of democracies. One thing we can do in the health area is, maybe we can look to an organization like NATO. NATO has a number of centers of excellence for cybersecurity, for maritime defense. Perhaps health should be one of those centers of excellence that's developed, and maybe Canada, with its expertise in this area, could help lead that, so that when we face another pandemic, because we will, we have trusted allies that we can work with, whether it's with regards to PPE, with regards to medicine. We can have that network in place and a strategy, just like we do in other cases, in other areas of security with NATO. We can have that plan in place. And I'll just come back quickly to my original point, is Magnitsky legislation and Magnitsky sanctions. Building a Canadian alliance first of like-minded civil society organizations who can together present the case, and several cases where there's clearly identified officials who have engaged in human rights abuse and corruption, and present these to the government. The government has been very slow to fully implement this legislation, but there are avenues to do this, and there's a team within Global Affairs that can accept these names. This is one thing that we need to do. And then Canada needs to work with our international allies, again, with the European Union, who's coming very close to adopting Magnitsky legislation, European-wide legislation, the UK, which has already adopted it, the US, and Australia, which is probably about 6 to 12 months away from adopting their own legislation, harmonizing those sanctions, because there is a real deterrence effect here. Like I had mentioned earlier, these officials, at least we know very much in the Russian case, they have used Canada to deposit millions and millions of dollars of assets. There were apartment complexes in Toronto where a former now Russian senator had well over $50 million invested. He was hiding those funds here. When they know that these sanctions are being used, and they're being actively used, they will think twice before they act. So this is something that we can do quite immediately. We don't need to wait for this COVID pandemic to end. We can start acting on this right away. So those are a few ways that we can start standing up to China and other similar regimes.
Thank you. I just have one or two, because you've been very panoramic with this. But in terms of actual actions, one thing I think is Taiwan was recently kicked out of the WHO Council. So although they're not a full member, they're on the council. And one area, perhaps Canada can lead with coalition to reinstate Taiwan, because it'll send a very direct message to the PRC, and it's very critical. It's not a banana republic, Taiwan's an effective country with the economy that's vibrant, democracy, and they've evolved. And the thing with Taiwan for us is that they've evolved from the Kuomintang model, almost near one party, to this. So I think it's a really interesting model for China also, in a sense, because I regard the Singapore, Taiwan, to be models for China, because they're and Hong Kong, and because they're Chinese majority populations, So they can't make a cultural thing that this does not fit our culture. That's why I think the Communist Party of China is so vituperative again in their hatred of that. Number two, let's keep India, Japan, Indonesia, 250 million people. They're a linchpin of ASEAN in that part of the world. They are facing the physical kind of resurgence in the South China Seas. Canada for years, I worked for CEDAW for many years, and we've had a long program engagement with Indonesia. I think it's time to talk to some of our friends, not as an alliance against China, but as an alliance to promote the values that we talk about. And then those two things, and the last one is internally. So we need to talk to political parties and start to put some of this in their platform. The reworking the relationship with China. You can say China, or you can take regimes like China. We're very keen to beat at the Burmese because yes, at one level it's an easy one. We have no economic interest much there, and we can bash them up. But the elephant in the room is China. And so those would be my kind of things. But thank you very much. Yeah, Gloria.
Yeah, I would like to echo your point on Taiwan. I think definitely Taiwan and Hong Kong have tremendous wealth of experience and infrastructure being built in dealing with disinformation and also China's sharp power. In fact, Taiwan and Hong Kong are ground zero to the infiltration and manipulation from Communist China. Canada, as well as the rest of the world, can learn a lot from the journey that these two places have gone through over the past few decades. And therefore, I think it's of utmost importance for Canada, as well as international community, to number one, render our support and solidarity for Taiwan and Hong Kong as they preserve their core values of human rights, freedom, rule of law, and also democracy against the Chinese authoritarianism. And number two, we can also enhance our dialogue and exchange of experience with both Taiwan and Hong Kong. Because we can learn a lot from how they deal with China's sharp power from all fronts, government, community, media, etc. Particularly in Taiwan, they have a very mature civil society being built. And just like what I mentioned before, even in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, they have a lot of positive experience to share with the world. And therefore, in the future, I think Canada should also play a very active role in endorsing and supporting Taiwan to become a full member of WHO as well as other international institutions. I think this is the way to go, because we need to set a good example instead of letting China to lead us all into awful.
Well, thank you. That's been very, very rich. Sherbla, we were doing for 1.5 hours. I think we've passed it slightly, but I'm very grateful to all of you, and to at least have a video connection. But I hope this is not the beginning only. This is the start, and in many cases, you all have worked together. We have a couple of things here that we can digest. I think there's no minutes or anything, but it would be nice to put a couple of points. It's always good to see. And then also, if we could have more regular connections once the COVID-19 is tamed, however long that will take, it would be good to meet up and have a common approach to some of this, so that we can, push more effectively. And we're a small organization, but we've been around for a long time, and we intend to continue to be a burr under the saddle of the CCP. Thank you.